My new supervisor smirked when he saw me walk through the door of Vertex Technologies. The same condescending smile my ex-boyfriend Marcus had given me when he said I was too ambitious for my own good before walking out of my life. He thought he still had power over me, examining my temporary ID badge with smug satisfaction. But when the board chairman announced my actual position at the morning meeting, Marcus's face turned ashen because everyone now understood that strategic consultant was just my cover. I was actually the incoming CEO who would be evaluating the entire management team, including him. As I stepped into the gleaming headquarters of Vertex Technologies that Monday morning, my heart raced with anticipation, not anxiety. The lobby's 30-foot ceilings and cascading water feature were impressive, but my attention was drawn to the massive digital display showcasing the company's latest innovations, many of which I already had plans to overhaul. 4 years ago, Marcus Chen had dismissed my career aspirations over dinner at Luminosa, the restaurant where we first met, telling me I lacked the killer instinct needed for the tech industry. Now he was about to discover exactly how wrong he'd been. The board's formal announcement of my true position was scheduled for 10 a.m., and Marcus's reaction would be worth every minute of the elaborate charade they had arranged at my request. I wanted to see how the company operated when people didn't know they were speaking to the new chief executive, especially him. "Your temporary access card, Ms. Rivera," said the security guard, handing me a badge that intentionally understated my position. I suppressed a smile at the irony of it all. Strategic consultant, it read, though the contract I'd signed last month clearly stated Chief Executive Officer. "Thank you," I replied, clipping it to my charcoal gray blazer, a strategic choice that walked the line between consultant and executive. I'd spent more time than I cared to admit planning this outfit, professional enough to command respect, but understated enough to blend in with the mid-level management. My hair was pulled back in a sleek ponytail, another calculated decision. Marcus had always preferred it down. The elevator doors opened onto the 42nd floor, and I stepped out into the executive suite. The receptionist looked up with a pleasant but impersonal smile. "Good morning. You must be the new consultant from Pinnacle Partners," she said, checking her visitor log. "Sophia Rivera," I confirmed, noting how the fake consulting firm name rolled easily off her tongue. The board had been thorough in establishing my cover. "Mr. Chen is expecting you. His office is down the hall, third door on the right. He's finishing up a call, but he said to send you in when you arrived." I nodded, feeling a flutter of anticipation in my stomach. This moment had played out in my mind countless times over. The past 4 years, ever since our relationship imploded in spectacular fashion, followed by his systematic attempts to blackball me in the industry. But the reality was even more satisfying than I'd imagined. Marcus's office door was ajar, and I could hear him speaking in that authoritative tone he reserved for business calls, the same one he'd used when telling me I wasn't cut out for executive leadership. "We'll need those numbers by end of day. No excuses," he was saying. "Vertex doesn't tolerate mediocrity." I took a deep breath and knocked on the doorframe. He looked up, phone still pressed to his ear, and froze. The recognition was immediate, a split-second widening of his eyes before he recovered, quickly ending his call. "I'll call you back," he said abruptly, setting down his phone. He stood, straightening his designer tie, a nervous habit I remembered. "Well, this is unexpected," he said, voice carefully controlled. "Sophia Rivera. It's been what? 4 years? 4 years? 2 months?" I replied, my tone professional. "Life has a way of coming full circle, doesn't it?" He gestured to the chair across from his imposing glass desk. I noticed the corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline, the kind of office I'd once told him I aspired to have. He'd laughed then. "So, you're our new strategic consultant," he said, studying my badge with barely concealed amusement. "Interesting career path." "It's been educational," I said simply. "I'm sure it has," he replied, leaning back in his ergonomic chair. When HR sent over your paperwork, I almost couldn't believe it. Sofia Rivera, brought in to evaluate our operational efficiency. He chuckled. Life does have a sense of humor. I smiled placidly, letting him believe he still held all the cards. The antique clock on his wall showed 9:15 a.m. In exactly 45 minutes, everything would change. I hope there won't be any awkwardness given our history, he continued, his tone suggesting he was doing me a favor by even mentioning it. None whatsoever, I assured him. I'm here to do a job, Marcus. Nothing more, nothing less. He nodded, seemingly satisfied with my response. Good. Because Vertex is on the cusp of something big. We can't afford distractions. I noticed the mock-ups. On his desk, the Atlas project, Vertex's make-or-break venture into quantum computing. The project I'd soon be overseeing, though he didn't know that yet. I understand, I said, nodding toward the designs. The Atlas project looks ambitious. A flicker of surprise crossed his face. You've done your homework, though I suppose that was always your strength, the details. It's the big picture that requires a different kind of vision. The condescension in his voice was so familiar it almost made me laugh. Some things never changed. Speaking of the big picture, I said, checking my watch, I believe there's a management meeting at 10. I was told I should attend. Yes, the quarterly review, though I'm not sure you'll get much from it on your first day. It's mostly high-level strategy discussion among the executive team. His emphasis on executive team was subtle, but clear. A reminder of the hierarchy he believed still existed between us. I'm a quick study, I replied, standing, and I'd like to get a sense of the company culture from the top down. Marcus nodded, gathering his tablet and a leather portfolio. Follow me, then. I'll introduce you as my... He paused, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. Consultant. As we walked toward the conference room, employees nodded deferentially to Marcus while casting curious glances my way. I caught fragments of their whispered conversations as we passed. Is that the woman from Pinnacle? Board's been very secretive about why she's here. Chen seems tense about something. Perfect. The rumor mill was already at work, creating exactly the atmosphere of anticipation I'd hoped for. Through the glass walls of the conference room, I could see various department heads filing in, the board members already seated at the far end of the table. Among them was Chairwoman Diana Valdez, the woman who had personally recruited me after my successful turnaround of Meridian Systems. Our eyes met briefly, and she gave an almost imperceptible nod. After you, Marcus said, holding the door open with exaggerated courtesy. I stepped into the room, fully aware that in exactly 7 minutes, the carefully constructed world where Marcus Chen held all the power would come crashing down. And I would be there, watching as he realized that the woman he had so thoroughly underestimated was about to become his worst nightmare. His boss. The conference room buzzed with hushed conversations as executives arranged their tablets and notepads. Floor-to-ceiling windows showcased San Francisco's skyline, a view I'd soon be seeing daily from the CEO suite just down the hall. Marcus guided me to a chair near the middle of the table, not at the end where decision-makers sat, but not at the perimeter where assistants perched either. The perfect spot for someone of middling importance. Everyone, before we begin, I'd like to introduce Sofia Rivera, Marcus announced, his hand resting casually on the back of my chair in a subtle display of authority. She's a strategic consultant brought in to evaluate our operational processes. She'll be observing today's meeting. Several curious glances were exchanged around the table. Consultants weren't usually invited to executive meetings, particularly not on their first day. But no one questioned Marcus openly. I noticed a few discreet Google searches on phones beneath the table, executives trying to figure out who I was and why I was really there. Thank you, Marcus, I said, my voice measured and professional. I appreciate the introduction. I opened my tablet to a blank document, appearing ready to take notes. My actual agenda was stored securely in my mind. Observe the power dynamics, identify the strongest and weakest members of the executive team, and watch Marcus in his natural habitat before everything changed. Chairwoman Valdez sat at the head of the table, her silver-streaked hair framing a face that had outlasted 3 decades of tech industry upheaval. Beside her sat Grant Peterson, CFO, whose nervous finger-tapping betrayed the financial challenges I already knew Vertex was facing. Across from him was Imani Washington, Chief Innovation Officer, whose reputation for brilliance was matched only by rumors of her frustration with the current leadership. These would be my top executives once the announcement was made. Their reactions, in the next hour, would tell me everything I needed to know about how to proceed. Marcus took his seat near Valdez, close enough to signal his importance, but not presumptuous enough to sit directly beside her. The hierarchy was clear: Valdez at the top, Marcus and the other C-suite executives in the next tier, and me, supposedly, somewhere far below. "Let's begin with quarterly performance," Valdez said, nodding to Peterson. As the CFO launched into his presentation, I studied the room. Marcus maintained that confident posture I knew so well, shoulders back, chin slightly raised, the posture of someone who believed himself untouchable. 4 years ago, that confidence had attracted me. Now I recognized it for what it was: arrogance, without sufficient foundation. My mind drifted to the first time we'd met at an industry conference where I was presenting research on quantum encryption. Marcus had approached afterward, all charm and interest, asking questions that pushed beyond the superficial. Our dinner that evening had stretched to midnight as we debated the future of technology, shared career aspirations, and discovered unexpected common ground. He was brilliant, ambitious, and attentive, a combination I hadn't found in San Francisco's dating pool. Our relationship had progressed rapidly. Within months, I was practically living at his Russian Hill apartment, accompanying him to industry events and sharing ideas about innovations I hoped to pursue. The first cracks appeared when my career began gaining momentum. A major tech journal published my article on neural interface design. Microsoft expressed interest in my research. And Marcus's supportive comments gradually gave way to subtle critiques. "Your ideas are interesting theoretically," he'd say, "but you lack real-world business experience to implement them. The tech world requires a certain ruthlessness you haven't developed yet. You're talented in your area, Sophia, but executive leadership requires a different skill set." The CFO's voice pulled me back to the present. Quarter-over-quarter growth is at 2.3%, which puts us behind projections by approximately 4%. I noticed Marcus's slight frown, the way his pen tapped against his notepad. He didn't like hearing about shortfalls, especially not in front of the board. "Peterson, we discussed adjusting those projections last month," Marcus cut in smoothly. "The market shift in Southeast Asia affected everyone's numbers." "The board was not informed of any adjusted projections," Valdez replied, her voice neutral, but her gaze sharp. Marcus recovered quickly. "I wanted to bring a complete analysis to the board rather than preliminary adjustments. My team is finalizing those figures this week." I made a note on my tablet, recording this interaction. Financial transparency issues, exactly what Valdez had hinted at during my interviews. The room's tension was palpable as Marcus and the CFO exchanged charged glances. "Moving on to the Atlas project timeline," Valdez continued, nodding to Imani. Howden, the innovation officer, stood, commanding attention instantly. "We're at a critical juncture with Atlas. The quantum processor is performing beyond expectations in controlled tests, but commercialization remains our challenge." I leaned forward slightly, genuinely interested. The Atlas project represented the kind of breakthrough technology that could transform Vertex from a solid performer into an industry leader, if executed properly. It was precisely why I'd accepted this position despite knowing Marcus worked here. The opportunity was too significant to pass up simply to avoid an awkward reunion. The marketing approach is too cautious, Marcus interjected. We should be positioning Atlas as revolutionary, not merely evolutionary. Marketing without a finalized commercial product is premature, Washington countered, her measured tone belying the firmness of her position. We need another 6 months minimum. 6 months puts us behind Quantum Nexus and their Zeta Core processor, Marcus argued. We need market positioning now, commercial readiness or not. I watched this exchange with heightened interest. Marcus was advocating for style over substance, promising the market something they couldn't yet deliver. It was exactly the approach that had sunk his previous company, though few people knew he'd been the architect of that spectacular failure. I did. The wall clock showed 9:45 a.m., 15 minutes until the announcement. I could feel Valdez's occasional glance in my direction, gauging my reactions to the discussion. The other executives remained oblivious to what was coming, focused entirely on the quarterly business at hand. Let's table the Atlas timeline discussion for now, Valdez said, checking her watch. We have another matter to address before proceeding with the full agenda. Marcus looked momentarily confused. This deviation wasn't on the schedule he'd helped prepare. I kept my expression neutral even as my pulse quickened slightly. Before we continue, I'd like to thank everyone for their patience during our executive search process, Valdez began. As you know, Richard's unexpected retirement left us needing steady leadership to guide Vertex through this critical phase with Atlas and our other initiatives. The room grew quieter. Several executives sat straighter, in their chairs. Marcus's expression shifted to one of careful neutrality, the look he adopted when he wanted to hide his thoughts. The board has conducted an extensive search over the past 3 months, Valdez continued. We've interviewed dozens of candidates with the specific experience and vision needed to take Vertex where it needs to go. Marcus's posture changed subtly. He'd applied for the CEO position, a fact he hadn't known I was aware of. The board had interviewed him twice, but ultimately decided his leadership style wasn't what Vertex needed for its next chapter. His confident smile now looked slightly strained as he glanced around the table. I'd like to thank Marcus Chen for his interim leadership during this transition period, Valdez added, nodding in his direction. His dedication to Vertex has been noted and appreciated. Marcus nodded in acknowledgement, his expression a practiced mask of professional gratitude. But I could see the tension in his jaw, the slight stiffness in his shoulders. He'd expected to be named CEO himself, had likely been counting on it. This public appreciation felt to him like the preamble to a consolation prize. Today, I'm pleased to finally announce our selection, Valdez said, her gaze sweeping the room before settling on me, and to introduce someone who has already begun the process of understanding our company from the ground up. The room fell silent as executives followed Valdez's gaze to where I sat. Confusion flickered across several faces. Marcus's expression froze, the realization beginning to dawn on him a split second before Valdez confirmed it. Sofia Rivera will be assuming the position of Chief Executive Officer, effective immediately, Valdez announced, her voice carrying clearly through the suddenly silent room. Her credentials speak for themselves. Pioneering work in quantum encryption, the successful turnaround of Meridian Systems, and most recently, her leadership of the Neural Interface Division at Microsoft that resulted in 3 breakthrough patents and a 300% increase in valuation. I could feel Marcus's eyes on me like a physical weight as I maintained my composed expression. The moment I had anticipated for 4 years, since he had dismissively told me I lacked executive potential over dinner at Luminosa, had arrived. But it felt different than I'd imagined. Less about triumph over him, more about the responsibility I was about to assume. Ms. Rivera has spent the past week meeting discreetly with board members and key stakeholders, Valdez continued. At her request, she began today as an observer to get an unfiltered view of our operations before formally stepping into her role. Around the table, Expressions ranged from shock to curiosity to calculation, as executives rapidly reassessed who I was and what this meant for their futures. But I kept my focus on Valdez, deliberately not looking at Marcus, though I could sense his rigid posture beside me. "I believe Ms. Rivera has a few words she'd like to share," Valdez concluded, gesturing toward me. The moment had arrived. I rose from my seat, removing the strategic consultant badge and placing it on the table as I faced the executive team that was now mine to lead. "Thank you, Chairwoman Valdez," I began, my voice steady and assured. "I appreciate the board's confidence and look forward to working with all of you to guide Vertex through its next chapter of innovation and growth." Only then did I allow myself to meet Marcus's gaze directly. His face had drained of color, his earlier smugness replaced by a complex mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension. The man who had once told me I lacked the killer instinct for executive leadership was now looking at his new CEO, and the morning meeting had only just begun. Before we dive deeper into Sophia's journey from dismissed girlfriend to Vertex Technologies' revolutionary leader, hit subscribe to join our community of ambitious professionals. Together, let's explore more stories where strategic patience leads to the sweetest success. Now, let's continue with what happened next in that explosive boardroom moment. The silence that followed my introduction as CEO lasted exactly 4 seconds. I counted them in my head as I surveyed the faces around the table. 4 seconds where the power dynamics of Vertex Technologies completely recalibrated, like tectonic plates shifting beneath the polished mahogany conference table. Grant Peterson, the CFO, recovered first. "Welcome aboard, Ms. Rivera," he said, professional enough to adapt quickly to the new reality. "I look forward to walking you through our financial position in detail." "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," I replied. "I'd particularly like to discuss those projection adjustments that weren't presented to the board." My tone remained pleasant, but the message was clear. I'd been paying attention, and financial transparency would be a priority. Peterson nodded, shooting a quick glance at Marcus, who sat unnaturally still beside me, his knuckles white around the pen he was gripping. Imani Washington was next, her brilliant mind already calculating what my leadership might mean for her innovation department. "Congratulations, Ms. Rivera. Your work on neural interfaces at Microsoft was groundbreaking. I'd be interested in your thoughts on our approach to the Atlas quantum architecture." "I've been following your progress closely," I responded. "Your instinct for solid engineering before marketing is one I share. We'll talk soon." I deliberately emphasized this point, aware that Marcus had just argued the opposite position. Around the table, the remaining executives offered their congratulations. One by one, their tones ranging from genuinely welcoming to carefully neutral. Each was already assessing how to position themselves with the new CEO. I cataloged their reactions mentally, noting who seemed threatened, who appeared relieved, and who remained inscrutable. Throughout this exchange, Marcus remained silent, his breathing measured in the deliberate way I recognized from our past, his technique for controlling his emotions in high-stress situations. Finally, as the initial round of greetings concluded, he gathered himself. "Quite the surprise," he said, his voice almost succeeding at casual. "Congratulations, Sophia." The use of my first name wasn't lost on anyone. It suggested familiarity, a past connection. Exactly what I'd expected him to do. Establish that he had insider knowledge of the new CEO, a relationship that predated my arrival at Vertex. "Thank you, Mr. Chen," I replied, my deliberate formality drawing a clear professional boundary. "Your interim leadership has positioned the company well for this transition." A muscle twitched in his jaw at the words interim leadership, but he maintained his composure. Several executives exchanged curious glances, sensing the undercurrent but not yet understanding its source. "Ms. Rivera and I are already acquainted," Marcus added, addressing the room. "We worked together on several projects some years ago." This careful reframing of our relationship, transforming a personal connection into a professional one, was classic Marcus. Controlling the narrative had always been his strength. I had anticipated this move as well. Indeed, I agreed pleasantly. Mr. Chen and I have known each other for several years. His perspectives on leadership have been educational. Those who caught the subtle emphasis on educational glanced between us with increased curiosity. Chairwoman Valdez, who knew the full history, allowed herself the briefest smile before steering the meeting back to business. Now that introductions are complete, let's proceed with the quarterly review, she said. Ms. Rivera, the floor is yours to conduct the remainder of the meeting as you see fit. And just like that, the conference room of Vertex Technologies became my domain. The seat at the head of the table, the one Marcus had been angling toward for months, was now unquestionably mine. I moved there with measured confidence, setting my tablet before me as executives shifted in their seats, adjusting physically to the new center of power. Let's continue with the Atlas Project timeline, I said, opening the digital presentation. Imani, would you walk us through the engineering milestones and challenges? As Washington began her detailed explanation, I observed Marcus from my peripheral vision. He had repositioned himself, leaning back slightly in his chair, arms crossed. It was the posture he adopted when strategizing, when recalculating his approach. I recognized it from board games he'd play to win at all costs, from arguments where he'd shift tactics mid-discussion if his initial position weakened. He was already planning how to adapt to this new reality, how to position himself advantageously, with a CEO who knew exactly who he was, perhaps better than anyone else in the room. The meeting continued for another hour. I asked pointed questions, demonstrated detailed knowledge of Vertex's products and challenges, and outlined a clear vision for addressing the company's most pressing issues. With each competent question and insightful comment, I could see the executive team's perception evolving, their initial surprise giving way to cautious respect. And with each demonstration of my command of the business, I could see Marcus's expression, growing more complex, surprise, calculation, and something that might have been grudging admiration warring beneath his professional mask. That concludes our quarterly review, I said finally, closing my tablet. I'll be meeting with each department head individually over the next few days. Please have your teams prepare current project statuses and key challenges. My assistant will be in touch to schedule. As the executives gathered their materials, many lingered, approaching to introduce themselves more personally or to position their departments favorably in my attention. Through the bustling activity, Marcus remained seated, watching the proceedings, with calculated calm. Mr. Chen, I said as the room cleared, I'd like to meet with you immediately following this session to discuss your current projects and responsibilities. His eyes met mine, searching for some hint of my intentions. Of course, he replied smoothly. My office or yours? Mine, I answered simply, gathering my materials. Amanda will show you the way. As I exited the conference room, now surrounded by executives vying for my attention, I caught a glimpse of Marcus still seated, staring at the space I had occupied during the first half of the meeting, the subordinate position he had so carefully selected for me, never imagining how completely the tables would turn. By the time I reached the CEO's office, my office, Amanda had already replaced the nameplate on the door. Sophia Rivera, Chief Executive Officer, it read in sleek, modern lettering. The office itself had been transformed overnight from Richard's traditional dark wood and leather to a clean, contemporary space with glass and steel accents. The floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the Bay Bridge and the bay beyond, a vista I had once told Marcus I dreamed of having from an executive office someday. Your first official meeting as CEO is scheduled in 15 minutes with Mr. Chen, Amanda informed me, handing me a folder. Here's his performance history, project portfolios, and team assessment. Thank you, Amanda. I replied, accepting the folder and setting it on my desk. A desk positioned to maximize the view I had once been told I would never earn. As I settled into my chair, adjusting it slightly, my phone buzzed with a message from Chairwoman Valdez. Flawlessly handled. The board is impressed. Dinner tonight to discuss next steps? I responded with a brief affirmative, then opened Marcus's file, scanning quickly to confirm what I already suspected from the meeting. His performance was solid but not exceptional. His leadership style created high turnover among direct reports. His projects typically launched on time, but often required significant post-release modifications. The picture painted was of an executive, more concerned with appearance than substance, with claiming credit rather than building sustainable success. A knock at the door interrupted my review. "Mr. Chen is here for your meeting," Amanda announced. "Send him in," I replied, closing the folder and centering it on my desk. Marcus entered, his composed expression betraying nothing of what must have been a tumultuous morning. He had used the brief interim to adjust his approach. His posture was open, his expression professionally cordial. "Congratulations again," he said, taking the seat across from my desk without waiting to be invited. "The board made an unexpected choice." "Did they?" I asked mildly, meeting his gaze directly. "I thought you might have seen it coming. You kept your career moves quiet these past few years," he responded with a slight shrug. "Last I'd heard you were still in research at Microsoft." "I moved from research to leadership 2 years ago," I said. "After the neural interface patents, they created a division around the technology. I built it from 3 engineers to a team of 60 before Meridian recruited me as CTO." He nodded, absorbing this information. "And now Vertex, quite the trajectory." There was something in his tone, not quite admiration, not quite resentment, but a complex mixture of both. "Life takes interesting turns," I agreed. "I believe you once told me I'd never reach the executive level because I lacked killer instinct, that I was too focused on the technology and not enough on the politics." He didn't flinch at the direct reference to our past. "People change. Clearly, you developed the necessary skills." "I didn't change, Marcus," I said quietly. "I just found environments that valued what I already was, rather than trying to become what someone else thought I should be." For a brief moment, the professional veneer cracked, and I glimpsed the man I had once known, surprised, perhaps even regretful. But it passed quickly, replaced by the calculated poise that was his hallmark. "So," he said, shifting to business mode, "what does this mean for my position at Vertex?" This was the moment he had been anticipating since the conference room revelation, the personal reckoning, the potential revenge. Would I fire him? Demote him? Use my newfound power to repay past humiliations? I opened his file deliberately, turning it so he could see his own performance metrics. "Your record here is mixed, Marcus. Strong on delivery timelines, weak on team development, excellent at securing resources, less impressive at utilizing them efficiently." He remained silent, watching me carefully. "The Atlas project is at a critical juncture," I continued. "It needs leadership that balances innovation with execution, technical excellence with market awareness." "I've been managing Atlas for 6 months," he replied. "My team understands the vision and the roadmap." "Your approach this morning suggested prioritizing marketing over engineering readiness," I noted. "That's precisely the kind of decision that damaged Neurotech's credibility in the market." He stiffened slightly at the mention of Neurotech, his previous company that had promised revolutionary neural interfaces, but delivered a product so flawed it was pulled from the market within months. Few people knew he had been the driving force behind that premature launch. "I did. That was a different situation," he said carefully. "Was it?" I asked, closing his file. "Or is it the same pattern of prioritizing perception over performance?" The silence between us stretched taut with unspoken history and the dramatic reversal of our positions. 4 years ago, He had sat across from me at Luminosa, casually explaining why my career would always be limited by my inability to play corporate politics. Now I sat behind the CEO's desk, evaluating his future at Vertex Technologies. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "What do you want, Sophia?" he finally asked, dropping the corporate mask momentarily. "Is this about us? About what happened?" It was the question I had asked myself repeatedly since discovering Marcus worked at Vertex. Was I taking this position partly for vindication? For the satisfaction of proving him wrong? For the chance to show him exactly what he had dismissed? "This isn't about us, Marcus," I replied truthfully. "It's about what's best for Vertex, for the Atlas project, and for the teams that will build our future." I stood, moving to the window, to gaze out at the bay. From this height, the water sparkled in the late morning sun, ferries cutting white paths across the blue surface. "You have two options," I said without turning. "You can continue leading the Atlas marketing and business development, reporting directly to Amani Washington, who will now head the entire project. Or you can take a generous severance package and pursue opportunities elsewhere." When I turned back to face him, his expression was unreadable. The Marcus I had known would have bristled at the idea of reporting to someone he considered a peer, would have rejected any perceived demotion outright. But perhaps he too had changed in the years since we'd known each other. "I need your decision. By the end of the week," I added, returning to my desk. "Vertex is entering a new chapter, Marcus. I need to know if you're willing to be part of it on new terms." He stood slowly, straightening his jacket with the same meticulous care he applied to everything in his life. "I'll consider the options," he said finally, his tone carefully neutral. "But I have to ask, did you know I was here when you took this position?" It was the question that had been lingering beneath the surface of our entire interaction. "Yes," I answered honestly. "I knew." He nodded once, processing this information, trying to determine what it meant, whether I had sought out this confrontation or simply refused to let his presence deter me from an opportunity. "The board meeting ends at 4, I said, effectively concluding our discussion. "I'll need the complete Atlas files on my desk before then." "You'll have them," he replied, moving toward the door. At the threshold, he paused, turning back with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "For what it's worth, Sophia, you proved me wrong, completely wrong." Before I could respond, he was gone, the door closing quietly behind him. I remained standing behind my new desk, in my new office, as CEO of Vertex Technologies. The moment I had imagined countless times, facing Marcus from a position of undeniable success, had come and gone. But strangely, it didn't feel like the culmination I had expected. It felt like merely the beginning of a much more complex story. The afternoon unfolded in a blur of meetings, introductions, and strategic discussions. My office became a revolving door of Vertex executives eager to establish relationships with their new CEO. Each brought carefully prepared presentations highlighting their department's successes while tactfully minimizing challenges, standard corporate theater I'd seen countless times before. Between meetings, I studied the Atlas project documents Marcus had delivered, precisely at 3:55 p.m., 5 minutes before my deadline. The files were comprehensive and meticulously organized, revealing both the project's extraordinary potential and its concerning vulnerabilities. The quantum processor at its core represented a genuine breakthrough, but the commercialization strategy showed the same fundamental flaws that had plagued Marcus's approach at Neurotech, prioritizing speed to market over product stability. "Your dinner reservation with Chairwoman Valdez is confirmed for 7 at Azura," Amanda informed me, appearing in my doorway as the office gradually emptied for the evening. "The car will be waiting downstairs at 6:30. "Thank you, Amanda," I replied, closing the Atlas files. "Could you schedule Dr. Washington for breakfast tomorrow? I'd like to discuss restructuring the Atlas leadership before making any formal announcements." "Already done," she confirmed with efficient professionalism. 7:30 a.m. at Ellery's in the Raum lobby. Also, your personal items arrived from Seattle. Your apartment is set up as requested. I nodded appreciatively. The transition team had managed every detail flawlessly, from the professional reveal to the personal logistics. My life had been carefully transplanted from Seattle to San Francisco over the weekend, while I'd been in board meetings, allowing me to step seamlessly into both my new role and my new home. "Will there be anything else this evening?" Amanda asked. "That's all, thank you. You've done excellent work today." After she left, I moved to the window, watching as San Francisco transformed from business hub to evening playground, office lights giving way to restaurant glows and bridge illuminations. My reflection in the glass showed a woman I sometimes still didn't recognize, poised, confident, dressed in the understated power attire of a tech executive. So different from the eager researcher who had once fallen for Marcus Chen's practiced charm and confident assertions. My phone buzzed with a message from Ellie, my former assistant at Meridian who had become a close friend. Saw the Vertex announcement. "Congrats, CEO. How did Mr. You'll Never Make It take the news?" I smiled, appreciating her remembrance of the nickname we'd created for Marcus during late-night strategy sessions at Meridian. "About as well as you'd expect," I typed back, currently deciding whether to accept a revised role or take the severance. "My money's on his ego rejecting the demotion," she replied instantly. "Men like that don't adapt, they just find new places to be the alpha." Her assessment wasn't unfair based on the Marcus I had known, but something about our interaction today had suggested the possibility of change, a flicker of recognition, perhaps even respect, that might indicate growth on his part. Or maybe that was merely wishful thinking, a remnant of the person I'd once believed him to be. "We'll see," I responded. "Dinner with the board chair now, details tomorrow." I gathered my things, taking one last look at the office, my office, before heading to the private elevator that would take me directly to the executive garage. The same elevator where Marcus and I had first kissed after a late-night industry event 6 months into our relationship, back when we both attended such functions as ambitious professionals on the rise rather than established executives. The memory surfaced unexpectedly, a ghost from a different life. The restaurant Valdez had chosen was deliberately discreet, a small, exclusive establishment in Pacific Heights, known for its private dining rooms and clientele of tech elites and venture capitalists. The maitre d' recognized the chairwoman immediately, escorting us to a secluded corner table with views of the Golden Gate Bridge in the distance. "An impressive first day," Valdez commented once we were seated with glasses of wine. The board. Members who observed remotely were particularly struck by your command of the quarterly data. Johnson mentioned you cited figures from 3 quarters ago that even he had forgotten. "I believe in thorough preparation," I replied simply. Valdez studied me with the shrewd assessment that had made her legendary in Silicon Valley. At 62, she had navigated the tech industry's evolution from garage startups to global powerhouses, outlasting countless executives who underestimated her quiet persistence and strategic mindset. "That's partly why we selected you," she acknowledged. "But preparation alone doesn't explain how seamlessly you managed the transition today, particularly with Chen." She took a measured sip of her wine. "Your history with him was a potential complication we discussed extensively." I assured the board it wouldn't be an issue, I reminded her. "And you've proven that correct, at least initially," she agreed. "But human dynamics are seldom so neatly resolved, especially when shared history and corporate hierarchy intersect." Her direct gaze was penetrating. "You offered him a choice rather than an immediate dismissal. Why?" It was the same question I'd been asking myself all afternoon. The board had given me complete authority over staffing decisions, clearly expecting that Marcus would be among the first casualties of the new regime. His performance metrics provided ample justification, and our personal history offered additional motivation that, while never explicitly discussed, had been tacitly acknowledged during my interviews. Vertex needs stability during this transition, I answered carefully. Immediate upheaval in the Atlas leadership could delay the project unnecessarily. A pragmatic response, Valdez noted, but not necessarily a complete one. She was right. Of course. My decision regarding Marcus wasn't purely strategic. It contained elements I wasn't entirely ready to examine. A complexity of feeling that extended beyond professional assessment into territory I'd thought long resolved. Marcus has talents that could benefit Vertex if properly directed, I added. His market instincts are strong, even if his execution is sometimes flawed. Under the right leadership, those talents could be valuable. Under your leadership, you mean, Valdez clarified. You believe you can manage him effectively despite your history. Because of our history, I corrected. I understand his strengths and weaknesses better than most. That provides an advantage in leveraging the former while mitigating the latter. Valdez nodded slowly, accepting this explanation, though her expression suggested she recognized the additional layers beneath my reasoning. And if he chooses the severance package? She asked. Then we'll move forward without him, I replied simply. The Atlas project is bigger than any individual executive, including Marcus Chen, or me for that matter. This earned a small smile from the chairwoman. Well said. Speaking of Atlas, the board is particularly interested in your assessment after reviewing the complete files. Our conversation shifted to business then. Detailed discussions of the quantum processors market, potential competitive landscape, and development timeline. Valdez listened attentively as I outlined my concerns and proposed modifications to the project structure, including elevating Imani Washington to full project leadership. Washington is brilliant but untested in market-facing roles, Valdez noted. That's why Chen was brought in originally, to complement her technical expertise with commercial acumen. Their skills could still complement each other effectively with adjusted responsibilities, I argued. Washington's technical judgment needs to drive the timeline, not marketing pressures. That was the fundamental flaw at Neurotech. Valdez raised an eyebrow. You seem well informed about Neurotech's internal dynamics. I met her gaze directly. I was consulting for their primary investor when the product failed. I saw the post-mortem analysis that never went public, the one that identified premature launch as the critical factor. The same premature launch Marcus advocated despite engineering concerns. That context wasn't in his employment history, Valdez remarked, frowning slightly. It wouldn't be, I replied. The official narrative blamed technical failures, not strategic decisions. Few people know. Marcus was the driving force behind the accelerated timeline. Valdez considered this information, swirling her wine thoughtfully. And you didn't share this insight during your interviews because it wasn't my place to volunteer confidential information from a previous client, I answered honestly. But now that I'm responsible for Vertex's success, I'm obligated to use all relevant knowledge to protect the company's interests. Including knowledge gained through personal connection, Valdez observed. Professional connection, I corrected automatically, then caught myself, noting Valdez's knowing smile. The board was aware of your prior relationship with Chen, Sophia, she said gently. Not the details, perhaps, but the fact of it. We didn't select you despite that history. In some ways, your navigation of complex personal and professional boundaries was seen as an asset. Leadership isn't just about strategy and execution. It's about managing human complexity. Her candor surprised me. During the interview process, my history with Marcus had been acknowledged only obliquely, treated as a potential liability to be minimized. Rather, sleep eluded me that night, despite the luxurious comfort of my new apartment. Around 3 a.m., I gave up trying, made a cup of tea, and settled onto the window seat overlooking the sleeping city. As fog rolled in beneath the Golden Gate Bridge, my mind drifted back to the pivotal conversation that had altered the trajectory of my relationship with Marcus, and ultimately, my career. It had been a warm evening in June, 4 years earlier. We'd been dating for almost 18 months, and I'd just received an offer to lead quantum encryption research at a promising startup. The position represented a significant advancement, higher salary, equity options, and crucially, the opportunity to build a team around my research concepts. We'd gone to Luminosa to celebrate, the same restaurant where we'd had our first date. The evening had started perfectly: champagne, reminiscences about our beginning, shared laughter over industry gossip. Then I'd shared my ambitious 5-year plan: lead research at the startup, patent key innovations, leverage those patents for a director-level position at a major tech firm, and eventually reach C-suite leadership. Marcus's expression had shifted, subtly. The supportive smile didn't quite reach his eyes as he sipped his champagne. "That's certainly ambitious," he'd said, setting down his glass. "But I think you might want to temper your expectations, Sophia." "Temper them?" I'd asked, confused by his tone. "The plan is already conservative. With the encryption algorithm I'm developing, we could revolutionize secure communications within 3 years, not 5. "I'm not questioning your technical abilities," he clarified, his tone shifting to the patient explanation he used when discussing business concepts with me. "I'm talking about the leadership trajectory. Executive paths require specific skills beyond technical expertise: political navigation, strategic vision, competitive instinct. Skills I've been developing," I pointed out. The university incubator program specifically highlighted my strategic planning in their assessment. He smiled in that particular way, indulgent, slightly patronizing. "Academic evaluations and corporate reality are very different worlds, Sophia. I've been in this industry a decade longer than you. Trust me when I say that the path to executive leadership requires a certain ruthlessness you haven't demonstrated." "Ruthlessness isn't the only leadership model," I argued, feeling a familiar frustration rising. This wasn't the first time Marcus had subtly undercut my professional ambitions while framing his comments as helpful guidance. "In tech, it is," he insisted. "Look at every successful leader: Jobs, Bezos, Musk, Kalanick. They all share the same: relentless drive and willingness to make difficult decisions regardless of feelings. There are other successful approaches," I countered. "What about Lisa Su at AMD? Or Ursula Burns? Or exceptions that prove the rule?" he interrupted dismissively. "And even they had to adopt traditionally masculine leadership traits to succeed." I'd set down my fork, my celebration appetite suddenly diminished. "So your assessment is that my 5-year plan is unrealistic because I lack what exactly? Testosterone? Cruelty? The ability to intimidate others? "Don't be dramatic, Sophia," he'd sighed. "I'm trying to help you set realistic goals. There's nothing wrong with being an exceptional researcher or technical leader. Those are valuable careers. I just don't want to see you set yourself up for disappointment by targeting positions that don't align with your natural strengths. And you've decided executive leadership isn't among my natural strengths," I stated flatly. "I'm saying success at that level requires qualities you haven't yet developed," he clarified, reaching for my hand across the table. "Look, we all have different paths. Mine happens to include executive leadership. Yours includes brilliant research. Together, we complement each other perfectly. Why push for something that doesn't play to your strengths?" I'd withdrawn my hand. Slowly, a cold clarity washing over me. "Because I get to define my strengths, Marcus. Not you." "Of course you do," he agreed quickly, sensing the shift in my mood. "I'm just offering perspective based on my experience. You'll never be successful without guidance from someone who understands the executive landscape." There it was, the statement that would echo in my mind for years afterward. You'll never be successful without me. Not explicitly stated, but clearly implied. "Let's table this discussion," he suggested, signaling for more champagne. "Tonight is for celebration, not career planning." But something fundamental had shifted between us during that conversation. For the first time, I saw clearly how Marcus perceived me. As a technically brilliant partner whose ambitions needed gentle containment, whose potential he felt qualified to define and limit. It wasn't malicious. He genuinely believed he was. Being helpful, realistic, protective even. That realization hurt more than outright discouragement would have. He didn't see me as an equal with different strengths. He saw me as fundamentally limited in ways he was not. The weeks following that, dinner conversation had revealed more patterns in our relationship. Marcus consistently positioned himself as the business and strategy expert, explaining concepts I already understood, recommending books I'd already read, introducing me to industry figures as my brilliant researcher girlfriend, rather than a peer with different expertise. When his company began exploring acquisition opportunities, he'd discussed potential targets with me, valuing my technical assessment but dismissing my strategic insights. When I'd suggested a particular quantum computing startup showed promise beyond its current valuation, he'd laughed. Their market positioning is all wrong. They'll never get acquired at a premium. 6 months later, Google had purchased that same startup for 3 times market valuation, precisely because of the technical innovation I'd identified. Rather than acknowledging my foresight, Marcus had explained all the unusual factors that made this acquisition an outlier, impossible to have predicted through standard analysis. The pattern became increasingly clear. My expertise was confined to a technical box in his mind, my potential predetermined by his assessment of my capabilities rather than my own ambitions or achievements. Our relationship ended 3 months after the Luminosa conversation, ostensibly over conflicting travel, schedules, and career priorities. The deeper truth was that I could no longer thrive in a relationship where my potential was predefined by someone else's limitations. The breakup had been civil, but final. Marcus had seemed genuinely surprised, having never recognized the fundamental disconnect in how we viewed each other. "I thought we were building something special," he'd said during our last conversation in the apartment we'd shared. "We were," I'd acknowledged, "but not something equal." I had moved out the next day, taking a position at Microsoft that accelerated my career trajectory beyond even my own ambitious timeline. The neural interface research I'd been pursuing as a side project received full funding and departmental support. Within 18 months, we'd filed 3 groundbreaking patents that transformed both encryption protocols and user authentication systems. My promotion to division leadership had come 6 months later, 2 years ahead of my 5-year plan. The executive mentorship program followed, then the Meridian CTO position, and now, Vertex. Each step had reinforced what I'd begun to understand during that fateful dinner conversation. Marcus had been wrong about my capabilities not because he was intentionally undermining me, but because he filtered my potential through his own limited perspective. He simply couldn't envision leadership qualities that didn't mirror his own approach. The gray light of dawn was beginning to illuminate San Francisco Bay as my memories circled back to the present. I stretched, realizing I'd been sitting at the window for hours, my tea long cold beside me. In a few hours, I would meet with Imani, Washington, to discuss the Atlas project's future, then potentially with Marcus to hear his decision about remaining at Vertex. Would he see the irony that his prediction had been correct, but for the wrong reason? I had indeed needed guidance to navigate the executive landscape. Not his guidance, but that of mentors who recognized potential beyond conventional models. Leaders who understood that the future of technology would be shaped by diverse approaches, not by replicating established patterns. My phone chimed with a morning reminder. I had an hour before I needed to leave for my breakfast meeting with Washington. I showered and dressed methodically, selecting a dark blue suit that projected confident authority without ostentation. As I fastened my grandmother's silver earrings, the same ones I'd worn to every significant career milestone, I considered what the day might bring. Marcus's decision would reveal much about who he had become in the 4 years since our relationship ended. Would his pride prevent him from accepting a position reporting to someone he'd once dismissed? Or had his experiences since then taught him to recognize talent and potential beyond his initial assessments? More importantly, how would I respond to either choice? The professional answer was clear. Vertex needed the best possible leadership, structure for the Atlas project, regardless of personal history. If Marcus could contribute effectively within the revised hierarchy, his talent should be utilized. If not, the severance package would allow both him and the company to move forward separately. The personal answer was more complex, layered with memories, assumptions, and the strange intimacy that comes from having once shared dreams with someone who now sat on the opposite side of a power dynamic neither of us could have anticipated. As I gathered my things to leave, my phone buzzed with a message notification. Marcus, I've made my decision. Available to discuss at your convenience today. His formal tone revealed nothing about which option he'd chosen. I responded with equal professionalism. 2 p.m. in my office. The day ahead would determine not just the leadership structure of Vertex's most important project, but whether two people with complicated history could forge a new professional relationship based on present reality rather than past perceptions. I stepped into the elevator, ready to face whatever decision Marcus had made. Regardless of his choice, the reality remained unchanged. The woman he'd once told, "You'll never be successful without me," now held his professional future in her hands. The irony wasn't lost on me. But as the elevator descended toward the lobby, I realized that this moment wasn't about vindication or revenge. It was about something more important. The opportunity to demonstrate a leadership model that recognized potential rather than limiting. That built people up instead of confining them to predetermined boxes. If Marcus chose to stay, perhaps he would finally understand what he'd failed to see 4 years ago. And if he chose to leave, someone else would benefit from the lessons I'd learned through his underestimation. Either way, Vertex and I would move forward, proving with each successful decision that there are many paths to effective leadership, none of which required sacrificing authenticity for advancement. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby, where Imani Washington already waited, tablet in hand and ideas clearly percolating behind her focused expression. I pushed thoughts of Marcus aside, focusing on the brilliant innovator before me, someone whose potential I was determined to recognize and nurture, rather than limit. "Good morning, Dr. Washington," I greeted her. "I'm looking forward to hearing your proposals for Atlas." Her smile was both professional and genuinely enthusiastic, the perfect combination for the innovation leader Vertex needed. "I think you'll find them interesting, Ms. Rivera. They address both the technical integrity and market timing concerns in ways I believe could satisfy all stakeholders." "That's exactly the balance we need," I replied as we walked toward the restaurant. "And please, call me Sophia." The day of reckonings and new beginnings had officially begun. Breakfast with Imani Washington proved even more productive than I had anticipated. The restaurant in the Vertex lobby, Ellery's, provided the perfect blend of privacy and casual atmosphere for our discussion. Washington had arrived fully prepared, with 3 alternative approaches to the Atlas project timeline, meticulously detailed on her tablet. "The fundamental tension is between market positioning and technical readiness," she explained, sliding the device across the table to show me her analysis. "Marcus wants to announce commercial availability at the Aurora demonstration next month, which would give us a perceived lead over Quantum Nexus. But the stability testing isn't complete," I noted, reviewing her data. "Exactly," Washington confirmed, her expression brightening at my immediate grasp of the situation. "The core processor exceeds performance expectations, but the commercial implementation requires at least 2 more testing cycles before we can guarantee reliability at scale, which would put actual release at 4 months minimum," she finished. "Marcus argues we can announce now and fix any issues before shipping. But that's precisely what happened at Neurotech," I concluded. "They announced before completion of stability testing, then couldn't resolve the issues before the promised shipping date. Washington nodded, clearly pleased by our aligned understanding. The reputation damage was catastrophic. I've been trying to explain this risk to Marcus for months, but he insists the market advantage outweighs the potential downside. I studied the third proposal on her tablet, a hybrid approach that would demonstrate the quantum processor's capabilities at the Aurora presentation while clearly positioning it as a technology preview rather than a commercial announcement. This would maintain Vertex's perceived leadership while providing the necessary time for complete stability testing. This approach is excellent, I commented. It satisfies the Defense Department's needs for the Aurora project while protecting Vertex from premature commitments. Washington's expression reflected both relief and vindication. That's been my position consistently, but Marcus insisted it would be perceived as weakness by the market. It's actually the opposite, I replied. Transparency about development stages demonstrates confidence and integrity. Companies that overpromise are the ones revealing insecurity. We spent the next hour refining the proposal, identifying key messaging for different stakeholders and establishing a realistic timeline for the various testing phases. Throughout our discussion, Washington demonstrated not just technical brilliance but strategic clarity, qualities I suspected had been consistently overshadowed in the previous leadership structure. Have you considered pursuing executive leadership? I asked as our meeting concluded. She seemed momentarily surprised by the question. Actually, Marcus suggested I focus exclusively on technical development. He said executive paths require different skill sets than technical innovation. I couldn't help but smile at the familiar framing. That's one perspective. I see it differently. The most effective technology executives maintain deep technical understanding while developing strategic vision. If you're interested, Vertex has an executive development program I'd be happy to recommend you for. Washington's expression shifted from surprise to thoughtful consideration. I'd like to explore that possibility. Thank you for seeing potential where others haven't. As we parted ways in the lobby, I reflected on our productive meeting. Washington clearly possessed capabilities beyond her current role, capabilities that had been systematically overlooked by a leadership perspective that categorized talent into rigid boxes. Marcus's fingerprints were evident in how her career path had been directed at Vertex, just as he had once attempted to direct mine. Back in my office, Amanda updated me on the morning's developments while I reviewed Washington's proposal. The executive team had already begun adjusting to the new leadership structure, with department heads sending revised project summaries and strategic assessments. The company-wide announcement of my appointment had gone out at 8 a.m., generating significant industry buzz and a 4% jump in Vertex's stock price. Also, Mr. Chen confirmed your 2 p.m. meeting, Amanda added. And the board secretary called to remind you about Thursday's presentation regarding the Atlas project decision. I nodded, mentally preparing for what promised to be a pivotal afternoon meeting. Whatever Marcus had decided, our conversation would establish the tone for Vertex's future, either with him in a revised role or navigating his departure. At precisely 2 p.m., Amanda announced his arrival. I stood behind my desk, watching as Marcus entered with careful composure. He had chosen a charcoal suit with a blue tie that matched Vertex's corporate color scheme, a subtle statement of company loyalty, I suspected. Thank you for meeting with me, he began formally, taking the seat I gestured toward. Of course, I replied, equally professional. I understand you've reached a decision regarding your position at Vertex. He nodded, his expression giving nothing away. I have. But before I share that decision, I'd like to discuss something I saw this morning. This wasn't the direct response I'd expected. Go ahead, I said, curious where this was leading. I observed, your breakfast meeting with Dr. Washington, he continued. Not intentionally. I was having coffee with a client at another table. I couldn't hear your conversation, but I could see how you interacted with her. I remained silent, allowing him to continue. You treated her as a peer, he noted, his tone difficult to read. You listened to her ideas with genuine interest. Your body language, the way you engaged with her presentation. You were mentoring her, weren't you? I was recognizing her capabilities, I clarified. Imani Washington is one of the most talented innovators I've encountered. Her potential extends far beyond her current role. A complex emotion flickered across his features. Recognition, perhaps, or realization. The Executive Development Program, he said quietly. You suggested she apply. It wasn't a question, but I nodded confirmation anyway. She's been asking about that program for months, he continued. I discouraged her, told her to focus on technical expertise rather than diluting her focus with management training. That was your assessment, I acknowledged neutrally. An assessment I'm now questioning, he admitted, surprising me with his candor. Watching you with her this morning, it reminded me of conversations we once had. Conversations where I provided similar guidance about your career path. The parallel wasn't lost on me, but I hadn't expected him to draw it so explicitly. Marcus, I began carefully, we should discuss your decision about... I'm accepting the revised position, he interrupted, his decision finally revealed. Reporting to Washington on the Atlas project. Full title reduction, compensation adjustment, the complete package as outlined. Despite having considered this possibility, I found myself momentarily speechless. The Marcus Chen I had known would never have accepted such terms. A clear demotion, reporting to someone he had previously sidelined, working under the leadership of a woman he had once dismissed as executive material. May I ask what influenced? Your decision? I inquired, genuinely curious about his reasoning. He met my gaze directly, more openly than at any point since our reunion. Several factors, pragmatic considerations about my career options, strategic assessment of Vertex's potential under new leadership. He paused, then added with unexpected honesty, and a recognition that my judgment about people's capabilities has been flawed in significant ways. I nodded, acknowledging both his decision and the self-awareness it suggested. The Atlas project will benefit from your market insights, particularly with Washington's technical leadership providing balance. I've reviewed her hybrid proposal, he continued, surprising me again. The one you discussed this morning. It's actually quite sound. Maintains market positioning while ensuring product integrity. I've been too focused on beating announcement timelines, and not enough on long-term reputation management. This level of professional self-reflection suggested a growth I hadn't anticipated. I studied him carefully, trying to discern whether this was genuine evolution or simply strategic adaptation to change circumstances. You're skeptical, he observed with a faint smile. I don't blame you. My track record for recognizing others' capabilities, particularly yours, doesn't inspire confidence. People evolve, Marcus, I replied diplomatically. Organizations need both consistency and adaptation. If you're genuinely committed to the revised structure and approach, Vertex will benefit from your contribution. He nodded, then asked the question that had likely been on his mind since yesterday's revelation. Was this your plan all along? Taking the Vertex position, knowing I was here, engineering this reversal of our positions? It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself repeatedly during the recruitment process. No, I answered honestly. The opportunity at Vertex was compelling on its own merits. The Atlas technology, the market position, the chance to lead a transformation at this scale. Your presence was a complication I decided to address directly rather than avoid. A complication, he repeated with a hint of irony. An appropriate word for our situation. Professional situations are often complicated by personal history, I acknowledged. How we navigate those complications reveals our priorities and character. And your priority is Vertex's success, he concluded. As is yours, I hope, I responded. Personal history aside, we both recognize Atlas's potential. My decision to offer you a continuing role wasn't about our past. It was about leveraging your genuine strengths while restructuring to address previous limitations. He nodded slowly, processing this. Clinical and logical, very much the executive approach. Would you prefer emotional decisions in the C-suite? I asked, allowing a hint of challenge in my tone. To my surprise, he laughed, a genuine sound I hadn't heard since our reunion. No, that's precisely what I admire about your approach. You've separated personal history from professional assessment more successfully than I likely would have in your position. The tension in the room shifted subtly with this acknowledgement. For the first time since discovering our reversed roles, we were approaching something resembling honest communication. So, I said, returning to practical matters, you'll meet with Washington tomorrow to formalize the transition? The board presentation on Atlas is Thursday morning. I'll be ready, he confirmed, standing to signal the meeting's conclusion. And Sophia, thank you for the second chance. Many executives wouldn't have offered it. As he reached the door, I found myself asking one final question. Marcus, what changed? The man I knew 4 years ago would never have accepted these terms. He paused, considering his answer carefully. 4 years ago, I evaluated others through the lens of my own approach, assuming my path was the only valid one to success. Recent experiences have been educational. Educational how? Let's just say you weren't the only person whose potential I underestimated, he replied cryptically. Life has a way of correcting our most confident misjudgments. With that, he departed, leaving me to wonder what specific experiences had created this apparent evolution in his perspective. I turned to the window, watching afternoon fog begin its daily advance across the bay. Marcus's decision to accept the revised role presented both opportunities and challenges. If his newfound self-awareness was genuine, the Atlas project would benefit from the balance between his market instincts and Washington's technical integrity. If it was merely strategic adaptation to changed circumstances, managing the dynamics would require constant vigilance. Either way, tomorrow's meeting with Washington would establish the foundation for Vertex's most important initiative. The past 24 hours had dramatically transformed the company's leadership structure. The next 24 would determine whether that transformation translated into functional reality. My phone buzzed with a message from Valdez. Chen's decision? He's staying, I replied simply. We'll update at Thursday's board meeting, her response came quickly. Interesting. Evolution or adaptation? I smiled at how precisely her question echoed my own thoughts. To be determined, I answered honestly. But either serves Vertex if properly managed. As the afternoon continued with a succession of executive introductions and departmental briefings, I found my thoughts repeatedly returning to Marcus's apparent transformation. The power dynamic between us had shifted completely, but something more subtle had changed as well. A mutual recognition that perhaps we had both evolved in ways neither could have predicted 4 years ago at Luminosa. Whether that evolution would translate into effective professional collaboration remained to be seen. But the initial power play I had anticipated, Marcus either rejecting the demotion outright or accepting it with barely concealed resentment, had instead revealed unexpected complexity in how we both had changed. Tomorrow would bring the first real test of this new reality when the three of us, myself, Washington, and Marcus, would need to align on the Atlas presentation for the board. The technical vision, market strategy, and leadership approach would need to form a coherent whole that served Vertex's future rather than any individual's ego. As CEO, my responsibility was clear. Ensure that personal history enhanced rather than undermined professional outcomes. The woman Marcus had once dismissed as lacking executive potential now faced the executive challenge of managing both a groundbreaking technology and the complex human dynamics surrounding it. The irony wasn't lost on me, but as the afternoon Light filtered through San Francisco's fog. I found myself focused less on irony and more on opportunity. The chance to demonstrate a leadership model that integrated technical excellence, strategic vision, and human understanding in ways traditional approaches often overlooked. Perhaps that had been the real limitation in Marcus's assessment 4 years ago. Not a failure to see my potential, but a failure to recognize that the future of leadership might look different from its past. 6 months later, I stood at the podium during Vertex's quarterly investor meeting, announcing the successful launch of the Atlas quantum processor. The stock price had doubled since my appointment as CEO, and industry analysts were calling Atlas the most significant quantum computing breakthrough of the decade. From the stage, I could see Marcus sitting beside Amani Washington, both of them nodding as I outlined the journey that had brought us here. Their partnership had evolved from reluctant collaboration into genuine synergy, with Marcus finding renewed purpose in market strategy while Washington flourished in her expanded leadership role. After the presentation, Marcus approached with an envelope. "For you," he said simply. Inside was a newspaper clipping from 4 years ago, my first published research paper on quantum encryption, which he had once dismissed as theoretically interesting but commercially limited. He had written across it, "I've never been more wrong about anything. Thank you for proving what real leadership looks like." I smiled, tucking the note away. "Sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all," I told him. "It's building something so undeniably brilliant that even your critics become believers." Success, it turned out, wasn't about proving someone wrong. It was about proving yourself right.